I'm here with David Webster from the University of Gloucestershire. I'm Peter Kernahan, I'm from Marling School, and we're talking about Buddhism. We've looked at the life of the Buddha, and we discovered that he was enlightened, and as part of his night of enlightenment, he discovered these four noble truths. And the first of the noble truths is dukkha. David, tell us a little bit about what is this noble truth of dukkha?
Well, rather than just tell you about it, which would be great, obviously, but I want to kind of give people a more kind of authentic feel for it, I'm going to read out the kind of original kind of notion of it when the Buddha recounts the four truths in the sutra that sets in forth the wheel of Dharma. He gets the whole thing of Buddhism going, where he says, "Now this, bhikkhus, monks, is the noble truth of suffering, or dukkha. Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, illness is suffering, death is suffering. Union with what one is displeasing is suffering. Separation from what is pleasing is suffering. Not to get what one wants is suffering. In brief, the five aggregates subject to clinging are suffering." Brilliant.
Now, if you look at that reading specifically, if you read it really closely, it seems to be there are three kinds of suffering the Buddha wants us to understand. He talks about ordinary suffering, dukkha, as it were, the sort of stuff that he himself experienced, old age, sickness and death, and seeing the four sights. But then he talks about this second kind of suffering, vipanava dukkha, and this is the kind of suffering that results from the impermanent nature of things. And he says there's a third kind of suffering when we understand the conditionality of all things, the conditioned states, samskara dukkha. And in this we have an insight into some further teaching. The three marks of existence comes through this teaching. It seems a bit pessimistic, does it? Some people think this is a very pessimistic teaching. What do you think, David?
Yeah, absolutely. You can see why people do that. When I read it out, it was one suffering after another. It just didn't sound so kind of like a very uplifting and joyful core teaching for a religion. And some people have compared the types of suffering that you were just talking about to European French philosophy, like existentialism, the sense that everything's pointless and meaningless, and a kind of draining away of things' value when you realise that it might be important to you, but in a few years, in 10 years, in 50 years, it will all be gone, it will all be dust, and just endlessly going on, and that kind of can really pull it away. The comparison often made by some Buddhists is that the Buddha isn't offering a pessimistic or optimistic reading. He's very much like a doctor. He's offering a diagnosis. He's saying, life hurts. Now what we really need to do is work out what's going on here. Why is it hurting, and can we do anything about it? And that model of not wanting to get drawn into, is it realistic? Is it pessimistic? Is it optimistic? But to say, hold on a minute, how good a diagnosis of the human condition is it, is a different way of approaching that.
Now, suffering is sometimes described as being stressful and stress-related, and the Buddha. Now, that kind of feeds into Buddhist ideas about, it's quite important to think about mental states and the ideas of your mind. And the three kinds of suffering, very much part of that is the mental, suffering is a sort of mental condition. Why is that significant for the Buddha, do you think, that mental suffering is actually sometimes more important than even physical suffering?
There are two ways in which I think it's really important. One is that because Buddhism ultimately comes to recommend what is a mentally orientated prescription for this problem, so the meditative path is, and your mental states are things you can control. I can't control the wind that's blowing, the rain that's falling on me, the harshness of the world and the brutality of others. There's not much I can do about the world being as harsh as it is, but I can control my response to it. And often suffering is seen as either being caused by or certainly magnified by the way I respond to it. So I might get a certain amount of physical pain from somebody punching me, but actually a lot of psychological pain will also come from the fact that I'm scared for my life, that I'm worried about my good looks being damaged by being punched in the face or whatever. I can magnify the dukkha, the suffering, through all my anxiety, through my clinging, and if I can let go of that, vast proportions of the suffering I feel just evaporate.
Now, let's broaden it out a bit. The Mahayana tradition has a slightly different take on suffering. Dukkha is something that's only real for deluded beings. What do they mean by that suffering is only real for deluded beings?
Well, if you want to view the Buddhist teachings in a more optimistic, cheery light, as we might go down that kind of route, you can say, well, actually, you choose, or you, because of your conditioned past, you come to experience the world as either full of suffering or full of beauty and joy, and you're in control of that. So that if you can shed your delusions about permanence, you can shed your delusions about things being eternal, things of this sort. If you shed those delusions, you start to experience the world in more blissful, more joyful ways. So the suffering that comes from your delusions, when those delusions evaporate, so does the suffering. And we might explore Mahayana Buddhism in one of our other videos, but there is a different take which sees it as orientated around the being, and you ultimately, through the choices you make, choose whether to experience the world as dukkha or as something else.
We see that in the Heart Sutra. There's no suffering, no origin of suffering, no cessation of suffering, no path, but we'll have to pick that up.
Yeah, that confuses the hell out of students,
yes,
so we'll talk about that another time.
Excellent. Now, broadening out yet again, looking at some synoptic links, the problem of evil and suffering is a philosophy topic that you've written on, and A-level students and undergraduate students will have to deal with if they do philosophy. How do you think the Buddha's arguments about the reality or lack of reality of suffering plays into wider debates about the problem of evil and suffering?
The first thing that students will notice is that the problem is constituted or framed very differently. In Western theology and theological philosophy, the problem is framed as whose fault is it? Yeah. You know, is it God's fault that I just pushed somebody over? It's probably my fault. Is it God's fault there's a famine, however, and there's a plague and whatever it might be? So it's about responsibility. So that frame gives us quite different answers if we look at it in Buddhism. It asks us whose fault it is. It's mostly our fault. Yeah. Which, in a sense, I think that's miserable. I don't much like the idea that it's my fault. But then the alternative, well, I can do something about it. And it's very much the idea of being an individual-centered response to suffering. And I can follow the path the Buddha has made as a way of reducing that suffering. But we needn't always frame it in the Western way and say, actually, Buddhism is a religion founded around a response to suffering. And the first noble truth, the first thing that he realizes and wants to communicate to his followers is what's going on in terms of suffering and the bad things in the world.
So, just to finish off, he seems to present the truth of suffering in an objective way. It's an objective feature of the world. Is that problematic, do you think?
It is problematic if we take it at face value. I think the more you study Buddhism, the more students drill down into the text, the more they'll find evidence that it seems to be an objective feature of the world as we currently experience it. But the way in which we currently experience the world turns out to be much more optional than originally thought.
Thank you very much. Thank you.